Tonight's adult bedtime history is all about pockets, a soft, soothing journey through their quiet history. Hello and welcome to Drift Off and Discover. Before we begin, a brief note for your safety. Please do not listen to this wander through history while driving or operating machinery. Only listen when you're somewhere you can relax safely and completely. As night settles in, our bodies often feel ready for rest long before our minds agree. Thoughts drift in, fragments of conversations, worries about the future, tomorrow's to-do lists, a persistent hum that can make sleep feel just out of reach. Right now, though, there is nothing you need to solve, nowhere you need to be. Your only task is to rest. And since the mind rarely likes to be truly empty, tonight will give it something soft to hold on to, a slow, unhurried journey through the history of something small, often overlooked, yet surprisingly rich with stories stitched quietly into everyday life. So, settle in, get comfortable, acknowledge the security of the bed or sofa gently supporting you and anchoring you to this safe space. And let's begin to think about pockets. Stay with me. Because when you begin to pull on the thread of something as ordinary as a pocket, when you really look at it, you find yourself somewhere quite extraordinary. You find yourself inside centuries of human life, inside the everyday decisions of farmers and queens, tailors and factory workers, travellers and kings. Pockets, it turns out, speak to something deep in us, the need to carry what matters, to keep close what we might need, to move through the world with a little something tucked quietly away. So let's begin, slowly and easily, right at the very beginning. As we wander gently back over 5,000 years to a time long before anyone had ever sewn a pocket into a garment, people still needed to carry things. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Our earliest ancestors wandering across open landscapes, moving with the seasons, they had tools, small ones, important ones, a piece of sharpened flint, a length, a smooth stone used for grinding seeds, things that mattered, things worth keeping, and so they found ways. The simplest and perhaps the oldest was the pouch, a small bag, maybe made from animal hide or woven from plant fibres, tied at the top and carried by hand, or looped over the shoulder, or fastened to the body with a cord or strip of leather. Archaeologists have found evidence of carrying pouches that are extraordinarily old. The Iceman, a natural mummy discovered in the Alps in 1991, preserved in ice for over 5,000 years, was found wearing a small leather pouch on his belt. Inside it, when researchers looked very carefully, they found a scraper, a drill, a flint flake, a bone awl, and a piece of dried fungus that may have had medicinal uses. Imagine him wandering across a mountain carrying his toolkit. He had thought about what he might need. He had prepared. There is something quietly moving about that. The pouch on his belt wasn't just a practical object. It was a record of his mind, what he valued, what he anticipated, what he wanted to have within reach. In a way, looking at what someone carries has always told us something true about them. And that idea that what we carry says something about who we are runs all the way through this history, right up to today. Let's move a little further along, into the ancient world of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. In ancient Egypt, people used simple linen bags, often carried by hand or suspended from the wrist. We see them in tomb paintings, small, neat pouches, tied with a cord, held almost casually at the side. Wealthy Egyptians might have had bags made of finer material, perhaps decorated, perhaps scented, but even the humblest versions served the same purpose, keeping things together, keeping things close. In ancient Greece and Rome, the situation was similar. The basic garment of the day, the tunic, the toga, had no built-in place to store things. There were no seams with small secret compartments, no cleverly placed slits in the fabric. The garments were draped and folded, beautiful in their simplicity, but not exactly practical for someone needing to carry a handful of coins to the market. So people used bags. The Greeks called one common type akebisis. The Romans had various names for various kinds of pouches and sacks. They were carried by hand, slung over the shoulder or tied to a belt or cord around the waist. The belt in particular was becoming an important object, not just for holding clothing in place, but as a place to hang things from. You could attach a small knife, a bunch of keys, a little bag of coins, all from the belt. It became a kind of portable shelf worn around the body. This idea of the belt as a carrying device would persist for a very long time, for centuries really. It's something we'll keep coming back to as our story unfolds. Now let's settle into the Middle Ages. This is a rich period for our story, and a wonderfully textured one. Imagine Europe somewhere between the 11th and 15th centuries. The world was slower. Most people lived and worked within a few miles of where they were born. Clothing was precious and handmade, always time-consuming to produce, repaired and mended and passed down. People did not own very many garments. What they had, they cared for. In this world, clothing still doesn't have built-in pockets, but people have developed a beautiful range of solutions. The most common is the hanging pouch, sometimes called a scrip or a gypsier, or simply a purse. These were small bags, usually of leather or woven cloth, attached to a belt and worn at the hip. They might contain coins, small tools, a folded piece of parchment, a lucky charm, or a fragment of a saint's relic wrapped in cloth. Whatever mattered most, day to day. And these pouches were not hidden away. They were worn openly, visibly, at the front or side of the body. In many cases they were decorated. Wealthy people had pouches of tooled leather, embroidered silk, fine metalwork at the clasp. Your purse told the world something about your status. It was in a quiet way, a statement. There's a particular type of medieval pouch I find quite lovely. It's called an almoner, or an alms purse. These were carried specifically to hold coins for charitable giving. You'd wear your alms purse, and when you encountered someone in need, you could reach for it. The very act of carrying it was a form of intention, a reminder, worn on the body, of how you wanted to move through the world. Knights and soldiers had their own carrying traditions. A knightly belt might hold a sword, of course, but also a dagger, perhaps a small horn or whistle, and a wallet or pouch of some kind. The more elaborate the belt and its attachments, the higher the status of the wearer. Pilgrims, those extraordinary people who walked hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles to holy sites, had their own distinctive bag, the scrip. A simple flat leather pouch slung over the shoulder, containing the bare necessities for survival on the road. Food, perhaps, a few coins, a letter of safe passage if they were lucky. The scrip was so associated with pilgrimage that it became a symbol of the journey itself, appearing in art and poetry of the period. And then there were keys. Keys deserve a small, gentle mention here, because they are one of the oldest carried objects and one of the most psychologically interesting. In the medieval household, keys were power. The person who held the keys to the stores, the cellar, the strongboxes, was the person who controlled access to resources. In a well-run household, this was often the mistress of the house, the lady or the housekeeper, and she wore her keys openly, hanging from her belt as a visible symbol of her authority and her trust. To carry the keys was to be trusted with something important, to be, in a sense, the keeper. Now let's move into the 16th century, the 1500s, and something new was beginning. Clothing was becoming more complex during this period. The Renaissance was reshaping not just art and philosophy, but fashion. Garments were becoming more structured, more layered, more elaborate. There were sleeves and doublets and many layers of underpinnings. And somewhere in all that layering, tailors began to notice something. There was space, hidden within the folds and seams, where a small bag might be tucked. The earliest true pockets were, in a sense, interior pouches, small bags that were accessed through a slit in the outer garment. They weren't yet sewn into the seam of a garment in the way we think of pockets today. They were separate little bags, tied around the waist underneath the outer layers, and reached through a gap in the skirt or robe. This might sound inconvenient, but there's something rather lovely about it too. These early pockets were secret. They were private. They were held close to the body, hidden beneath layers of fabric known only to the wearer. Women in particular developed a very elegant version of this. The tie-on pocket, sometimes just called a pocket in the singular, was a pouch, usually pear-shaped or oval, made of linen or wool or sometimes beautifully embroidered fabric, tied around the waist with a ribbon or cord and accessed through a slit in the outer skirt. Women might wear one on both hips or just one. They were often homemade, sometimes given as gifts. They were private, personal objects, and they could hold quite a lot. Some surviving tie-on pockets from the 17th and 18th centuries are genuinely beautiful, embroidered with flowers, birds, initials, made with obvious care and skill. These were not throwaway items. They were made to last, to be used every day, to become familiar through use. And here's something worth pausing on. In these pockets, women kept their secrets from the world. A thimble, a folded letter, a coin or two, a piece of ribbon, a small knife, smelling salts, a keepsake. These pockets were wonderfully capacious given their modest appearance. The dress hid them completely, and the pocket itself, hanging beneath, could be surprisingly roomy. Meanwhile, men's clothing was developing in a different direction. By the 17th century, men's garments, particularly the coat and breeches, were beginning to include sewn-in pockets. A deep side pocket in a gentleman's coat became increasingly standard. The pockets of a well-made coat might hold a pocket watch, a folded letter, a small book, a set of keys, a handkerchief, a pair of gloves. The pockets of a gentleman's breeches might hold coins, a penknife, a small flask. Men's pockets were becoming built-in, accessible, and generous in size. This is a divergence that will matter enormously, and we'll return to it. The 18th century, the 1700s, is in many ways the golden age of the pocket. For men of means, this was a period of wonderful, deep, functional pockets. The long coats fashionable in early Georgian England had enormous side pockets. Men could, and did, carry extraordinary things in them. Samuel Johnson, the great English writer and dictionary maker, was famous for filling his pockets with orange peel, which he apparently enjoyed for reasons no one entirely understood. Writers carried manuscripts. Scientists carried instruments. Travellers carried things they might need for a journey. There was, in this period, a whole culture around certain carried objects. The pocket watch, for instance, rewound and checked many times a day, attached to a chain, consulted with ceremony. The snuff box, small, often exquisite, made of gold or enamel or decorated tortoiseshell, carried in a waistcoat pocket and produced with a particular elegant gesture in social situations. The calling card case, the small notebook or memorandum book. To be a gentleman in the 18th century was to have the right objects, carried in the right way. And it's in this century that we first begin to see something like pocket culture, an awareness of the pocket itself as something worth thinking about. Poems were written about pockets. In 1728, a comic poem was published called The Lady's Dressing Room by Jonathan Swift. Not about pockets precisely, but very much a product of an era when personal objects and personal space were becoming subjects worth writing about. And there is one wonderful document from this era that I find particularly delightful. A small publication from 1676, just slightly before our main century, called The Needle's Excellency, which included patterns for embroidered pockets. Women were being given not just the object, but instructions for making it beautiful. The pocket was worth adorning. It was worth spending an evening on, needle and thread in hand, making something both useful and lovely. Women in the 18th century continued to use tie-on pockets, and they remained substantial. But as the century progressed, fashion began to shift, and this shift would have consequences. The silhouette of women's fashion in the late 18th century began to move away from the wide, layered skirts of earlier decades. The influence of neoclassical style, inspired by ancient Greece and Rome, which we visited at the beginning of our journey, began to produce thinner, more draped, more figure-following gowns, and in these lighter, more narrow garments, a bulging tie-on pocket was increasingly awkward. Something had to give, and what gave was the pocket. As the 18th century closed and the 19th began, something happened to women's pockets that is honestly a little remarkable. They largely disappeared. The slim, high-waisted silhouettes of the Regency era, those flowing gowns you might associate with Jane Austen with morning rooms and country walks and letters sealed with wax, were simply not compatible with large pockets beneath the skirt. The line of the dress would be ruined. The fashionable figure would be disrupted. And so women were encouraged by fashion, by society, by the structure of their own clothing, to carry their things externally, in a small bag held in the hand, the reticule. The reticule was a small, elegant little purse, drawstring closed, made of silk or velvet or beaded fabric, held in the hand or dangled from the wrist. It was pretty, it was ladylike. It was also, compared to a proper tie-on pocket, quite tiny. A reticule might hold a handkerchief, a few coins, a small card case, perhaps a folded letter. Not much else. There's a rather pointed irony here. The word reticule shares its Latin root with ridicule, and some people at the time noticed this. The reticule was sometimes called a ridicule, partly as a pun, and partly, one suspects, as a quiet comment on the absurdity of asking women to manage their daily lives with a tiny ornamental bag. Jane Austen, in her letters, mentions making herself a bag. Her niece Anna sent her a pattern for one. These small domestic acts, making the thing one needed because the clothing didn't provide for it, speak to a kind of quiet ingenuity, and also to a real constraint. Women needed to carry things. They had always needed to carry things. And now their clothing was actively preventing it. This tension between women's practical needs and fashion's indifference to those needs would continue for a very long time. In some ways it continues still. The 19th century brings us a new world. The Industrial Revolution is remaking everything. How goods are made, how people work, how they live, how they dress. For men, especially working men, the 19th century is a period of practical, substantial clothing. The workman's trousers, durable, dark, built to last, begin to include multiple pockets. Tradesmen, labourers, craftsmen all needed to carry tools, small equipment, money, a knife. Their clothing was designed with this in mind. The waistcoat, that layered vest worn beneath a jacket, had its own pockets, including the small fob pocket just below the waistband, designed specifically for a pocket watch. To have a watch was to have made something of oneself. To keep it in the right pocket, on the right chain, was to carry status quietly on your person. Denim, that most enduring of fabrics, enters our story here. Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis patented their riveted denim trousers in 1873, workwear designed for miners and labourers who needed clothing that wouldn't fall apart under heavy use. The rivets at the stress points of the pockets were specifically to prevent them from tearing. Because workers were filling their pockets constantly with tools and ore samples and anything else that needed carrying, those riveted pocket corners are still on your jeans today. We've kept them, even though most of us aren't mining gold in California. They're a small, quiet piece of living history. For women in the Victorian era, the situation was complicated. Crinolines and bustles and elaborate layers made tie-on pockets possible again, at times. But the social rules around women and their possessions were also complicated. A respectable woman's possessions were supposed to be minimal, modest, not too practical, not too numerous. Some Victorian women, particularly those beginning to enter the workforce, to work as teachers, as shop assistants, as nurses, as telegraph operators, began to push back against this. There was, in the latter part of the 19th century, a growing conversation about women's dress reform, and pockets were part of that conversation. Rational dress reformers argued that women's clothing should be practical, comfortable, and allow for movement. That women working in the real world needed real pockets. These were not trivial arguments. They were part of a broader movement toward women's independence, toward the understanding that a woman's body and clothing were her own to manage. The early 20th century is, for the history of pockets, a fascinating and somewhat hopeful period. The First World War changes everything, as it changes so much. Women enter the workforce in enormous numbers, in factories, in offices, in hospitals, driving ambulances, working the land. Practical clothing becomes not just acceptable but necessary. Skirts shorten, silhouettes simplify, and pockets, real functional pockets, begin appearing in women's clothing more regularly than they had for a century or more. The 1920s brings the flapper era, shorter skirts, dropped waists, a general loosening of fashion's restrictions, and with that loosening comes, in some designs, more pocket room. Not universally, fashion is always inconsistent, but the direction is toward practicality. Meanwhile, a new kind of carrying object is becoming widespread, the handbag. The modern handbag, as distinct from earlier small purses, develops through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As women begin to travel independently, to take public transport, to navigate cities alone, they need to carry more, a purse, keys, perhaps a small mirror, gloves, a handkerchief, a transit ticket. The handbag becomes both a practical solution and, increasingly, a fashion statement. But here is where a strange loop closes. The more fashionable and elaborate the handbag becomes, the less pressure there is on clothing manufacturers to provide women with pockets. If women will carry bags anyway, if bags are expected, if they are part of a woman's standard daily equipment, then why sew pockets into her coat? This logic, though it's rarely stated so plainly, shapes women's clothing for decades to come. By the middle of the 20th century, the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, there is a visible and measurable difference between men's and women's pockets. Men's trousers have deep front pockets, deep back pockets, sometimes a small coin pocket nestled in the right front. Men's jackets have breast pockets, side pockets, inside pockets. A man in a suit might have 6, 7, 8 pockets. He can carry his keys, his wallet, his coins, his cigarettes, his lighter, his pen, his notebook, his handkerchief, all without a bag. Women's clothing in the same period might have decorative pockets, small, shallow, positioned for appearance rather than function, or none at all. A woman in an elegant 1950s sheath dress might have nowhere to put so much as a coin without it showing. This is not accidental. Historians and fashion scholars have noted that women's pocket situation is closely linked to commercial interests. If women need to carry bags, and they do because their clothing doesn't provide, then women will buy bags. Bags are a significant commercial product. The absence of pockets in women's clothing is, in this reading, not simply an oversight, but a kind of structural arrangement that benefits those who sell the alternative. This might sound rather bleak, but it's worth knowing. And it's worth noting that women throughout this period found their own ways, sewing pockets into their own clothing, repurposing aprons with generous pocket fronts for domestic work, adapting and adjusting and managing as they always had. The apron, incidentally, deserves a quiet moment of appreciation here. The practical apron, worn for cooking, for gardening, for workshop tasks, has always been wonderfully pocket-rich, deep pockets for pegs, for tools, for seeds, for small gathered things. The apron is almost an embodiment of practical carrying culture, worn whenever the formality of outer clothes is set aside and the real work begins. Before we reach the present, let's take a small, wandering detour through some of the more curious corners of pocket history. Cargo pockets. These large external pockets, often with a flap and a button pleated to expand, have military origins. They appear on military trousers and jackets from the early 20th century, designed for soldiers who needed to carry ammunition, maps, rations, and equipment without a bag. In the 1990s, cargo trousers became a widespread fashion item, and they divided opinion fiercely, practical to some, aesthetically overwhelming to others. But their generosity of storage was undeniable. Hidden pockets have their own long and rather charming history. Tailors throughout the centuries developed ways to conceal pockets, inside coat linings, in the back panels of waistcoats, beneath the hem of a skirt. These were used for carrying valuables discreetly, for travelling with money hidden from pickpockets, sometimes for smuggling. There's a whole tradition of travellers' clothing with secret pockets sewn in, a tradition that continues today in those quietly practical travel jackets and vests marketed to cautious tourists. Pickpockets, of course, are the shadow side of all this. As long as people have carried valuables on their bodies, there have been those who sought to relieve them of those valuables. The medieval cut purse, who, as the name suggests, would cut the cord of a hanging purse to steal it, gave way to the modern pickpocket, skilled in accessing pockets that the wearer doesn't realize are being reached. Much of the design history of pockets includes a quiet arms race with this reality. Deeper pockets, button pockets, inside pockets, pockets with difficult openings. And then there is the tiny pocket, the small, almost vestigial watch pocket in jeans, sometimes called the coin pocket or the ticket pocket, which began as a practical fob for a watch and has persisted long after watches moved to wrists and then to phones. It fits, these days, approximately half a thumb. Yet it remains, sewn into the front of jeans across the world, a small, enduring reminder of the object that required it, the object it no longer holds. And so we arrive in the present. The modern pocket is a complex thing. In the best cases, it is deep, robust, and generous. A proper pocket that can hold a phone, keys, a wallet, all at once, without discomfort or the risk of things falling out when you sit down. In the worst cases, particularly in women's clothing, it is a lie, a suggestion of a pocket. A few centimetres of fabric sewn in that can fit perhaps 2 fingers if you're optimistic. Sometimes these shallow impressions are described in marketing as functional. They are not meaningfully functional. This has become, in recent years, a genuine cultural conversation. Studies have been done, earnest, careful studies, measuring the pockets in men's and women's jeans from major manufacturers, and finding that women's front pockets are, on average, about half the depth of men's. Some women's pockets cannot fit a hand. Some cannot fit a modern smartphone. The gap is real and measurable. There is something rather striking about the fact that in the 21st century, after all the technology, all the changes in society, all the shifts in how women live and work and move through the world, this particular inequality persists. Small, domestic, almost invisible. But there, more hopeful, there are brands now specifically building women's clothing with genuine pockets as a selling point. There are customers who actively seek this out. There is a demand, clear, vocal, sometimes quite funny about it on the internet, for the simple right to carry things in your own clothing. And there are other carrying traditions that remain alive and well. The backpack descended from those earliest leather pouches, carried on the back across mountains and through cities. The tote bag, the work bag, the small crossbody bag, all serving the ancient function of keeping what matters nearby. The tech industry has given us new things to carry: the phone, the wireless earbuds, the portable charger. And clothing is slowly adapting to hold them, or we are finding other ways. The AirTag hidden in a jacket pocket, helping you find your lost coat. The key fob tucked in a specific small pocket in a specific bag, always in the same place. The emergency £20 note folded into the back of a phone case. We are still, all of us, the descendants of that man walking across an alpine glacier 5,000 years ago, with his leather pouch and his scraper and his bit of medicinal fungus. We are still finding ways to carry what matters, still thinking about what to keep close. So there we have it, a long, slow, gentle journey through the history of carrying things. From the first pouches tied around the body, to the beautiful embroidered tie-on pockets of women in the 1700s, tucked beneath layers of skirt filled with small treasures, to the deep, practical pockets of working men in the industrial age, to the ongoing, unresolved conversation about who deserves a real pocket and who is offered the suggestion of one. It's a small history in some ways, a quiet one. No battles were fought over pockets, no civilizations rose or fell for want of a place to put a coin. And yet, as with so many small domestic things, the history of pockets tells us something real about the lives of ordinary people, about what they valued, what they carried, what they needed, and what they were or weren't given. There's a particular comfort, I think, in knowing that the desire to carry things is ancient and universal, that every person who has ever walked across a field or a market or a city street has had some version of this, a pouch, a pocket, a bag, some way of keeping the small necessities of their life gathered close. It's such a human thing when you think about it, to look at what lies ahead, to think about what you might need, and to tuck it into a pocket before you go. Tonight, you don't need to carry anything. You can set it all down now, whatever you've been holding today, the thoughts and the tasks and the worries. There's no pocket needed for sleep. It comes to find you lightly, without any of that. Just you and the dark and the quiet. Let the day fold itself up and settle somewhere soft. Let your breathing slow to its own gentle rhythm. Let your thoughts grow softer at the edges, less urgent, less sharp. You've been carried, in a way, through a long and winding story tonight, through centuries of human ingenuity and care, through embroidered pockets and mountain pouches and the small, stubborn wish to keep what matters close. And now the story is still, and the night is here, and all you need to do is rest. Thank you for spending this time with me on Drift Off and Discover. Sleep well, wherever you are. I'll be here when you're ready for another quiet journey. Good night. If you'd like more bedtime stories like this, you can subscribe. And if there's a topic you'd love to hear as you drift off, let me know in the comments.